5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hello, space enthusiasts. Welcome to another episode of the Space Business Podcast. My guest this week is Sven Przywarra, co-CEO and co-founder of LiveEO, a Germany-based Earth observation startup. LiveEO analyzes satellite data to generate actionable insights for non-space customers, for example in the railway or utility sectors. So it is what we call a downstream company. That means it does not operate its own satellites, but uses data from people who do operate satellites. They're also our first guests who are based in the great city of Berlin, and we'll talk about that. A couple of administrative comments. As I mentioned last time, feel free to email us your questions or comments on the episode at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com or post them on our Twitter, which is podcast_space. Also, if you enjoy the show, please leave us a review and or rating on your favorite podcast platform so more people can find the podcast. Okay, here's a couple of short messages about our sponsors. Then please enjoy my conversation with Sven from LiveEO. My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with the CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu. Hey Sven, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Sure, it's a pleasure. Sven, where are you joining us from?
I'm joining you from Berlin, our beautiful office in Berlin-Kreuzberg. Although I'm the only person in the office, it's nice to have this call from here.
Because we're still in Corona lockdown in Germany at the time of recording.
Exactly.
Without any end in sight, unfortunately, I think.
That's true.
Actually, before we delve into the company, while you're mentioning Berlin, I think, I'm sure actually you're the first startup we have on that's from Berlin. And I always like to ask about sort of the local space ecosystem because, some people are thinking about starting their companies and they're sort of thinking about locations where they want to base themselves. Do you want to just talk a little bit about the space ecosystem in Berlin?
Yeah, sure. I'm a huge fan of the Berlin new space ecosystem. That was one of the reasons I moved to Berlin. When I studied here business engineering at the TU Berlin, I also wanted to join a space company. And back then, there were not that many space companies in Europe overall. But there was PT Scientists, the company which wanted to launch a private lander to the moon. And so I joined that company. And since then, a lot of companies have started here. So we have a little Earth observation cluster with companies such as Planet, Up42, Smart Cloud Farming, and ourselves. And there's also a hardware cluster with companies such as German Orbital Systems, Berlin Space Technologies, Astrofine, and so on. So we really have a lot of competencies here in Berlin on the space side. And obviously, not only for space startups, Berlin is great, but also for startups in general, right? So you have a huge talent pool to source from, and space is super attractive. So it's also not that hard to find talent compared to, let's say, smaller cities somewhere across the world. Yeah,
I was going to say, because Berlin is possibly only second to London, sort of in European startup scene, right? A lot of very well-known startups in internet and in fintech, right? Like companies like N26. Does that also mean there's probably venture capital firms around as well, right? Which is nice to have on your doorstep.
Absolutely, yeah, sure. We have one investor who's from Berlin, so most of our investors are from all over the globe. But obviously, it doesn't hurt that a lot of events have happened here before Corona. I think now with the new normal, maybe this will change a little, but it's always great to also just have spots to connect with other founders and just to exchange in general. How is fundraising done? What should you look out for? And therefore, obviously, Berlin is very attractive and very practical.
Fantastic. And I can confirm as a German, it's really a fantastic city also to live in and to go out, like great restaurant and bar and, well, at least in normal times, nightlife I've seen and so forth. So to the extent that, LiveEO is hiring, and I think you are hiring, that actually I can very much recommend it as a location to be based.
Exactly. And just as a short side note, so once Corona is over, we also still again have our new Space Vision events, which we had for multiple years, where we invited speakers from new space companies to present themselves and then to have a beer together to just talk a little bit about this huge opportunity which we're currently looking at. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, enough about Berlin. Tell us about LiveEO, the company where you are the co-CEO and co-founder.
Yeah, sure. So LiveEO exactly has the goal to bring Earth observation data to enterprises. We believe that we're currently going through a revolution of Earth observation imagery, and we think that this data offers great opportunities to improve business processes and decision-making throughout the enterprise world. Currently, we're serving our services to customers in the utility and infrastructure space. So we've developed a full stack solution which translates satellite data into actionable insights for railway operators, electrical grid operators, and pipeline operators so that they can monitor and then maintain their infrastructure grids from space. Customers of us are, for example, the German railway operator, electric grid operators from Australia to the US, and a bunch of pipeline operators.
Can we just dive a little bit deeper into sort of what these use cases actually look like? Because if you're saying railway lines, it sounds like observing railway lines from space. That sounds kind of boring, but I assume this is about sort of like seeing that everything is okay, that there's no, like tree that fell onto the railway line or is coming too close and things like that.
Exactly. I think infrastructure grids are one of these kind of categories you don't really think about a lot when they are working, but you're thinking about them a lot when they are not working. So we try to prevent any damage from happening to these infrastructure grids, meaning that we monitor external threats to these infrastructure grids, such as already mentioned by you, vegetation, which grows too close to, for example, the railway network and could fall onto this in a case of a storm. The same is true for electrical grids. We also monitor ground deformation and third-party interactions alongside infrastructure grids. So we really have a holistic solution which offers the operators of these networks to just have a quasi near real-time overview over the entire external threats to their networks, which helps them to maintain these more efficiently. And in the end, for us as the end user, provide a better service.
How did you come up with this? I mean, was it like, you were taking the German railways like me and there was yet another delay because there was a problem on the track and you're like, I better start a space company? I'm kidding. How did you guys get the idea?
So my background is business engineering. My co-founder's background, he's an aerospace engineer. And so we were more coming from not the market pull side, but the technology push side. So we thought, okay, it's incredible what we're currently seeing here, really on the hardware side with all these new satellite constellation being launched. Back then, Planet just completed their mission 1, monitoring every place on the Earth every single day. And we said, okay, that's incredible. Let's do something with this kind of technology. And what we said was, okay, the missing link between the data which we have or will have in the near future and what the end user really needs is a software stack and a SaaS solution which really does this translation from raw imagery into actionable insights, really domain specific. And then we looked out for industries which could benefit from this. And in the beginning, we had a very wide scope. And then we looked at, we did some market analysis, some comparison with different target markets, which we would focus on at the beginning. And the infrastructure market came out as one which could serve the purpose very well, which is to prove that satellite data has a direct business impact to big companies and that it can be translated and also sold to them effectively. We said, let's try to use the infrastructure market as our prototyping market. We did that because we were also lucky, let's say, in German, you would say Glück im Unglück. We were lucky that there was a storm, obviously not something you should be happy about, but through that storm, which was at the beginning, at the end of 2017, a lot of trees fell onto infrastructure networks, and we said, okay, that's the perfect time. Let's do that. And so we won the Copernicus Masters, and then I took this as also like a boost to build up the first prototype for our infrastructure monitoring solution, and it took off from there.
Okay, and just for our non-German speaking listeners, Glück im Unglück, probably the closest translation I can come up with is silver lining. So the silver lining of some bad event, in your case, the storm, which sort of affected infrastructure. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about new Space Vision? How does that work, especially if you go back to normal times?
Yeah, exactly. So New Space Vision was exactly, in fact, the starting point also of LiveEO, because at the very beginning I thought I believe that there's currently something going on in the space ecosystem, but I don't have anyone to found something with. And so I started New Space Vision through that a little bit. I also met Daniel, my co-founder. And so what we're doing with New Space Vision is we're giving people a platform like you and other founders in the new space industry to present what they are doing, to find potential talent. So it's an event series here physically for Corona, and hopefully also in the near future. And also just right now, exactly, we have a podcast series and some online events. So really, we try to do, I think, something similar as you do, just to get more people excited about the space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what's the easiest way of people to find that? Is there a website?
Yeah. Exactly, newspacevision.com. That's our website, and the podcast can be found on all outlets.
Okay, great. We'll put that in the show notes to this episode. But so if I understood correctly, none of you guys actually had a background in these industries, right? So you guys really went through a very structured ideation process and said, okay, here is a sector where our solution may make sense. But once you had identified that, sort of what were the further steps of market validation? Did you just contact like a number of infrastructure companies and say, hey, can you give us a meeting? We want to explain space to you, or how did you guys go about that?
Yeah, so in the beginning was really that. So we looked at the market from an outsider perspective. None of us, exactly as you said, knew anything from an insider perspective. I think the general enterprise world is opening up to the thought that innovation also has to come from the outside perspective and the outside world, right? So we then tried to get in contact with as many innovation people as we could, especially in obviously the target accounts which we were looking at. And we sent out pitch decks, which are our idea. And these somehow made it to the right person in the organization. And then the first big market validation boost came when we entered an accelerator program from the German railway operator, which gave us really the market proof, the validation, and a close weekly contact with the potential client, which allowed us to really develop the solution very closely with the first customer. But because we had this close customer interaction, we were able to develop a solution to this customer needs. On the other hand side, our vision stayed with us from day one until today and the future to come. And we're building a solution which is not only useful for one industry, the infrastructure sector, but that we're building something which has applications in many other industries. And that was also the reason how made us build technology the way we did it.
So when you were in that accelerator program from Deutsche Bahn, which is basically the German railway operator, it sounds like basically you were almost doing like sort of a pilot there with an actual customer. And was that customer Deutsche Bahn, or was it somebody?
Exactly, that customer was Deutsche Bahn, yes. Exactly.
Okay, and after sort of that pilot was done, they liked your solution and they basically stayed on as a customer?
So they liked our solution, and then exactly we were able to convince them with a lot of work to stay on. I mean, we were still an early company back then, and built a solution to their requirements. And then what we also did relatively early was looking a little bit outside of the just customer, the one customer, but Japan, and looked, okay, what are adjacent customers are looking at, because often also you have this effects of scale, right? If you speak to multiple customers, maybe the thing which you do for one customer improves also the product for another one. And so we looked at the electrical grid operator and relatively fast scaled also in that direction, and now have multiple dozens electrical grid operators. So that's now our biggest market which we serve.
Yeah, I guess I can see the synergies. Once you got one and you got the pitch materials ready and everything, you might as well go to and you have, of course, also your software solution defined. As you said, the actionable insights. I mean, of course, you can just go to the next ones. But I just want to dig a little bit deeper on this sort of process of approaching customers who are not from the aerospace sector and who may just not be familiar with space at all, who can benefit from space technology. Because I mean, it's just relevant for many space startups, especially space application startups, and especially people who do data analysis of satellite data, whether it's for agriculture or insurance or utilities like you guys. For now, I see still a lot of people struggling. And I think the issue is a little bit on both sides. I mean, one, that the people in the
non-aerospace companies, they just don't understand space. And to some extent, they don't care, right? Because they're like, okay, I don't care that data comes from space. It's like you say, I want some actionable insights for my business. And on the other side, I think, unfortunately, very often also the startups, which at least for the moment are very often co-founded by space engineers, they don't make enough effort to understand the customer industries. I mean, it sounds like you guys obviously went through a long and deep exercise of doing that. So can you maybe just talk a little bit about that experience of approaching the people and maybe some best practices and looking back, sort of what you would recommend to other startups which are trying to break into customer industries that do not know space?
Yeah, I think like space is a great hook to spark interest, but it's never the reason why you land a deal. The reason why you land the deal is because you can answer a customer question with an answer which satisfies, also the budget and everything. So you should always think about not only what's possible, but what's also economically feasible. And then that has to be the pitch, right? Satellite data can be in the first line, but the rest should be just about the customer problem. And so I think that's super important. And then I would say it's really comes down to this. And just in the beginning, trying to ask a lot of questions. Early on, we hired people which came then from the infrastructure sector, from the energy sector. So our operations lead, for example, has 10 years background in the energy market consultancy world, right? So he knows the customer by heart and brought obviously also a lot of insights into the company. And that was also, maybe that's another learning, which is not only applicable, I think, to application companies, but to a lot of companies and maybe also startups in the hardware space. What we always try to do from the very first second on, so the very beginning, we didn't have any own money which we were able to invest. So we were just bootstrapping based on this pilot project and on public funding and pitch competitions. And so at the very beginning, we always looked, okay, what's the one thing which we are really not good at, and try to hire a person for this, even with the smallest kind of resources which we had, because we always said, okay, like money on the bank is great, but the opportunity cost is much higher. We don't use it now. And so with that, for example, using like the cash reserves you have to create pitch material, which is also maybe visually appealing, and we sometimes do better invest, although you obviously take a risk there. But I think in the early startup days, which I think this question was about, I think you should try to invest what you can to speak the language the customer is speaking.
And another question about that. So for your specific use cases, like for example, for the railway lines or the power lines, was your solution something that just wasn't possible before and hence you were showing them something completely new? Or were those customers doing that with some other means? I don't know, were they like flying drones or something and you guys could come and it's like, hey, we can do the same thing, but better and cheaper?
I mean, that's the ideal scenario, right? If you can say exactly like we do it better and cheaper, then it's a no-brainer. Yeah. I think with satellite data, that's very rarely the case. In some edge cases, that is. And if you found something like this, you struck gold. But with satellite data and our types of analysis, we improve already existing processes and can partially replace some of the current OPEX, right? So that's I think also the play with a lot of satellite-based solutions, right? Just take the agricultural example. We are not serving the agricultural market, but as an example, a farmer, if he surveys his or her field, they can gather much more, much deeper insights often than obviously satellite data can. But satellite data from Sentinel, for example, can give you really the overview over the entire farmland. So satellite data always, in my perspective, oftentimes always improves the processes rather than completely replacing something which is already there.
While you're talking about satellites, I think we just have to point out, just in case that wasn't clear to the listeners, so you guys do not own your own satellites. You basically take data from existing other satellites and you analyze it. It's what we call a downstream company in the sector. And where do you get your data from?
Very good addition. Yeah, exactly. We don't own our own satellites. That's a little bit, we see, sad. We love hardware, but it would be just too pricey, I think, for us. The first data source we took was Sentinel and the Copernicus from the Copernicus program. And from there on, we have used all scalable sources which are out there. Planet, Maxa, Airbus from Up42 and other sources. Really everything which is out there. And with that, we are really able to create the best data stack which is available for each customer all across the globe.
So you're using both free data, but you also paid data from
exactly. We pay for satellite data, and we use free available data. Yeah, free obviously is not always without a price. You still have to store it, and you still have to process it, but exactly, it's available. Yeah.
And let me ask you for the benefit of other potential entrepreneurs who are looking at putting up satellites. Is there any type of satellite data that you wish was available but isn't or isn't enough?
I think still it's a capacity problem to some degree. We could sell much more for our solution if the prices would be lower for high resolution tasking, for example, for high resolution imagery. That's one thing. I know that the existing constellations are working on this, but that's still, I think, a market which could see more competition. On the other hand side, exactly, I mean, a range of thermal mapping companies out there. So having thermal imagery can be very useful for smart city application and such. So this is definitely something which we would like to look at. And then there are more hyperspectral bands with a larger coverage, right? Because this is, I think, still something where we now have companies like Planet putting up super doves, which have multiple spectral bands, but just having the ability of an NMAP, like German planned scientific mission, on a commercial basis with a higher frequency, you could really serve also much more purposes. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm hearing sort of the wish list across the board, like more higher temporal resolution, which means more frequent revisits, higher spatial resolution. And by the way, what kind of spatial resolution are you guys looking for? What would be ideal?
So that really comes down again to the use cases. I think like this, and the resolution is one thing. Also, just like the depth of an image and the spectral details play a big role in that. But I mean, the more high resolution, the better. But this is then obviously always coming with more cost. So something smaller than 3 meters is definitely useful for real field applications, such as Planet is currently serving, and everything bigger than that is still okay, usable as a substitute or for large monitoring applications, right?
And so I was going to ask you whether you mostly use optical imagery, but then you already started mentioning things like thermal imagery and even hyperspectral. Can you give us an example how you would use thermal images, like basically images that detect temperature changes?
So we currently don't have thermal imaging use case which we serve to a lot of customers. We are in some POCs with some customers, but just because it's like a chicken and egg problem, there are no commercially available data sources which would fulfill customer requirements. So there are also no projects in this domain. But for example, applications could serve like the rapid post-event or disaster monitoring use cases, such as right after, for example, an overhead line struck fire, to monitor that. Just in other use cases where you want to maybe monitor exactly just the effectiveness of different industrial parks, right, or the output of industrial parks. There, it's kind of infrared imagery would be highly useful. But we also use radar imagery. So we really have built up a highly flexible. So we are now around 50 people, and of that, around 35 currently still are on the tech side. We're now hiring a lot of salespeople. So if anyone out there who's interested in joining us as a sales rep or in business development,
do they need a background in a specific customer industry or just general sales? General
sales. So what we believe is we are not selling a Earth observation solution. We're not selling a GIS solution. We're selling a software solution. So preferably the software background, but a great salesperson can sometimes sell everything. So we would just be interested to speak to people which have a drive.
So they don't. What I mean is they don't have to, for example, have deep knowledge already of the utilities industry. Like that.
Obviously, that's beneficial for sure, but that's not required per se. But coming back to the topic, so we are also analyzing radar imagery, and it requires a little bit of a head count to be able to do that. But yeah, that's what we are also doing.
So you mentioned that currently your main customer groups is the electrical utility operators and then the railways. But you did mention that you wanted to expand into other industries as well. What are the plans there? What other industries do you find interesting?
So currently we're really driving an open process to just explore other opportunities in other markets. So we have a business development team which really looks actively into other industries. We have a partnership with one of the world's biggest construction consultancies, CDM Smith. And with them, we are looking into some use cases. And in general, we are very open-minded also. So we believe that the tool set which we've built up offers us a lot of opportunities in a lot of fields. Now, that's also maybe just a learning for anyone who's coming from a technical background. Never underestimate sales, right, and marketing. We've built up this great technology. But I mean, although it could be used in a lot of industries, sales is like half of the equation, right? So we just want to make sure that with our business development, we identify the next right industry to expand into in the future. Yeah, so exactly, I've mentioned the construction market, but obviously there are other opportunities in the forestry market and so on, the insurance market and so on, which we currently just take a closer look at.
When you kind of expand into a new industry, I mean, you mentioned now the fact to not underestimate sales, and I totally agree with that. I mean, it's funny actually when I see the space startups that come across my desk as a venture capitalist. That's typically really what's lacking is on the business side, because again, most companies these days are so far still co-founded by engineers. But what do you think is more difficult? Is it sort of adapting the technology and maybe having to do adapted algorithms for the new industry, or is it that business side and just the sales side of breaking into the additional sector?
I would say it's the latter one. So because like technologically, we're solving very, very hard problems with a great team of engineers. But once these problems are solved, these problems can be solved, right? With sales, it's a battle by battle in each industry, right? So if I, for example, are able to classify something for industry A, I most probably will be able to classify something similar for industry B. But like having a different sales approach in two industries, knowing how the market works, and then also being able to create significant traction in this market is a challenge which is not that easy, where you can't just copy and paste the approach from previous industry.
By the way, I didn't ask about the team's background. I mean, I guess what you're doing at heart is basically data science / machine learning. Is that where you guys are originally coming from? Is that where the majority of the team is, or what does the team look like?
Yeah, the majority of our team are machine learning scientists, are geologists when it comes from the radar spectrum, are data scientists, computer scientists, cloud architects, exactly, because obviously we don't run anything on premise. We have everything in the cloud. So exactly, it's software engineers all across the board. Yeah.
How is the competitive landscape? I mean, I guess the good and bad thing about the downstream, again, the companies that we call downstream that analyze satellite data is it's much less capital intensive than anybody who's putting hardware into space, and much, much less, right? And so,
yeah.
Sort of like potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, you can really get started with a few $1 million. But of course, that also means it's easier to get started. Do you see a lot of other entrants, and so how do you try to differentiate yourselves also from people who may specialize in just one sector?
That's a very good question. It's funny, when we started our company, there was, at least from our perspective, no startup player in this industry globally, and since then a few followers have popped up. And also venture capital is following that industry. So we have raised multiple rounds, and also our competitors are pursuing that path. So there is competition and in the industry, but we are very convinced that our focus from the very beginning on building the most scalable and most optimized kind of technology offers us a lot of opportunities, which our competitors don't have. Also, we have raised the most venture capital, which has flown into the technological development. So we really believe that our technology is the most advanced one. That's the status quo, right? For the future to come, how do we make sure LiveEO is future-proof? We try to focus on speed when it comes to development, scalability when it comes to deployment, and automatization all across the board. So we try to build a very flexible system, but which works super well together. And also the head of our machine learning department has a PhD in machine learning. We hired him away from Morgan Stanley, Harvard. He's super smart, and he assembled a team of just great people, great talent, and also that takes time to be replicated. Yeah.
I realize I didn't even ask you how your service sort of like works and from the customer's perspective. You mentioned it's basically software as a service, right? So I assume there's some sort of platform the customer can log into, and then it's sort of like a subscription model. They pay by square mile or something like that.
Precisely. So we have a web app, we have mobile apps for different operating systems, and the customer logs in and then can access our data via that. Depending on the customer, we have also built API integrations. But yeah, that's how it is. The customer consumes data of ours by the extent of the network. Of the assets. Yeah.
And so you obviously have existing customers, as you mentioned, and hence you have existing revenues. If I may ask, in what kind of time frame do you think a business like yours can be break even?
Break even? If everything works well, we can break even next year, because I think. But I mean, do you want to? Do you want?
Yeah,
to break
of course.
Even, right?
You can always spend more on marketing and expanding into other segments and so forth. Yes.
Yeah, precisely. Right. Amazon. It took them quite some time to break even. We also believe that we are currently going through very interesting time in obviously this entire space, but also for ourselves as a company. So we really want to focus to grow as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So the related question, I guess, is, so as you mentioned, you just recently closed the financing round, and congratulations on that. So
thank you.
What are some ways you will use that capital?
So it's really like the main focus is on expanding our sales team. We've opened up a US office, and we're growing. Exactly, we're hiring a bunch of sales and marketing people. So that's one focus, and the other focus is just to further expand our tech team, just to build solutions which really scale. And these are the two areas we focus on the first one, because again, like we say, we are absolutely convinced that our technology is the best one, but we know that we can still do better marketing, for example. And now we want to focus on this too. Yeah.
What was the thinking? I mean, as you said, you guys are a relatively young company. What was the thinking behind the decision to already open up in the US? Is that something you figured it was important to get in early, or I assume you haven't exhausted the potential of the European market yet?
That's correct. But I think like in an AI space, if you build a local solution, right, for a problem which is similar all across the globe, you will in the end potentially lose against a competitor who serves a more global market, just because it is more attractive to the venture capital community to fund someone who has a global footprint, and also obviously the US American market in itself is very attractive. These were two reasons why we said, okay, we have to expand globally. The other beautiful thing is that satellite data obviously doesn't know any borders, so we can serve customers all across the globe. As we do, you can say focus first on Europe and then expand, but also the European market is unfortunately not one uniform market, but very different from country to country. So that's also not a quick win, right?
Yeah. So the other thing I was wondering with regard to your financing round is, how was the experience with the investors and getting them to invest in your business? I guess the nice thing you have is that your business, given its space, is relatively closer to things they already know, like AI, SaaS.
Exactly. So I think like so it was an interesting experience to raise the first round and then also the second round, so our seed and Series A. But I have to say that exactly because we're doing a downstream application, or that we've developed a downstream application, it is close to the space they are already familiar with. What they are not familiar with is the market environment, right? And so you have to support them in understanding where does the satellite operator stand, where do companies like other Descartes labs also stand, right? And where your own positioning is within the market. So you have to support them with understanding this. That's one important thing. And the other thing is that exactly also you see more and more investments in the Earth observation market, and even dedicated VCs, right? Like yourself, like others, just One Soil, a great company in Belarus, just raised a $5 million round, right? So you see like these kind of investment rounds in that space more and more often. Also, I think you have to support the investors which are not aware of the space, and B, there are more and more investors which are exactly specialized in that space, which is great.
Was there any particular question you kind of kept getting from the investors? Yeah,
you had either one of these two questions. One is, okay, but what do you do if the satellite operators do it themselves? And the other one was, okay, so satellite data is becoming a commodity. So how do you make sure that you differentiate yourself from others? And now, obviously, these two questions both go somehow in the opposite direction. So you were either speaking with one VC with the one hypothesis, or with the other one, the other hypothesis. Yeah.
What was out of curiosity, your answer to the first question, which basically is like, okay, if somebody like Planet wants to vertically integrate and just do much more downstream analysis?
Yeah, I think Planet or any other of the satellite operators has a great business model if if they sell their data effectively and on scale to a lot of clients. Because just with the same data, they can serve multiple use cases. Meaning if they take a picture of San Francisco, there are so many potential clients which could buy this data, and every time they would make revenue. And I believe that the specialization on making this as easy as possible and efficient as possible, that's really where they should focus on, it, which is a great business case. That's one reason why I believe they will just focus on providing the data effectively. But the other one is also just because it's extremely cost expensive to build solutions for individual markets, which again brings away your focus from your core, right? And stick to your core is something which I think is sometimes a good tip for any company.
But nevertheless, is a company like Planet or even Spire, which now will have probably a few $100 million additional capital in the bank. Do you regard those as potential exit options, or where do you think your exit options will lie sometime in the future?
I think the market is still growing, and these companies will also still grow. I believe that our solution fits more in the space of the end user, so who are already customers which are serving who are companies which are already serving a similar user group than ours, which are obviously giants of the industry, can be giants of the Oracle or something, SAP, companies like these, rather than the satellite operators, because you could come into a conflict of interest. Let's see. I mean, I couldn't have imagined what is currently happening in the space 5 years ago. So who knows what's going on in 5 years?
Yeah, where would you like to be in 5 years?
The global market leader in the Earth observation space for enterprise clients. That's our big vision. That's what we're working on very hard here at LiveEO. We want to monitor every major infrastructure across the globe and really make Earth observation data as accessible as the GPS signal today. So that's the big vision.
One question I'd like to ask entrepreneurs like yourself. So if you weren't doing LiveEO, but say you were still excited about what's going on in space right now, is there something else that you find particularly exciting that you think, okay, maybe I would be doing that?
Yeah, so I have this hypothesis that obviously successful businesses in space go from something which has no weight to things which have weight, obviously, right? It's logical. So it started with just having telecommunication signals, then pictures. I think now we're getting in the area where exactly it becomes feasible to fly something into space and to get something down from space as well. So I believe that space manufacturing is really something which I'm super interested in.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm super interested in this area. Unfortunately, I hadn't had the proper training in university to really assess the different opportunities. But just companies like Yuri from Germany or Vada Space, exactly. I think you even told me about them, right? What they are doing is super exciting, and I believe that there are a lot of opportunities which we just don't see just yet.
Yeah, I think from a venture capital investor perspective, we fully agree with that. And looking at that part with great interest. For the listeners, Mark Kugel, one of the co-founders of Yuri, he was on the podcast a few months ago. So you can look up his episode. And yes, Vada was basically incubated by Founders Fund a few months ago as another space manufacturing companies, and there's one or two others.
Yes, exactly.
Actually, quite interesting. So that kind of the space manufacturing, which is sort of a very nascent field, that kind of gets us conveniently gives us a segue into my final question, which is always about science fiction. And Sven, do you like science fiction? And if yes, what kind of science fiction is your favorite?
Yeah, so I really like science fiction. I have to be like, most probably it's a boring answer, but Star Wars episode 1, so last, chapter, but the chapter before that was one of my first movies in cinema, Jar Jar Binks and so on. That really sparked my interest in the space industry in general as a young child. And then I read a lot of books about the wider Star Wars universe. So I'm not such a big fan of the new movies, but the Star Wars universe written out in books, that's really what's really excited me as a young person. Now, unfortunately, I don't have that much time to read so much stuff, but that's I think my favorite serious.
Terrific. Sven, thank you so much for coming on, and good luck with deploying the capital from the investment round, and all the best for LiveEO.
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I really liked the previous episodes with the other great founders and people from the industry, and really excited for the future to come in this new space revolution.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.